The morning over occupied Europe was brittle and sharp, the kind of cold that bit through a man's leather gloves and found its way beneath his wool collar. Frost clung stubbornly to the wings of the P-51 Mustang parked on the airfield, its polished skin catching the first silver wash of dawn. Mechanics moved quickly with blowtorches and fuel lines, their breath rising like smoke signals into the frigid air. Somewhere across the English Channel, German radar operators were sipping their own coffee in dimly lit bunkers, listening to the pulse of their equipment, waiting for the familiar echo that meant American bombers were on the move again. They didn't yet know that this day would be different, that the skies they thought they owned were about to turn hostile in ways they could scarcely imagine. Inside the cockpit, a young pilot adjusted his oxygen mask and checked the dials. He could feel the vibration of the Packard-built Merlin engine rumbling beneath him, a sound that was both reassurance and challenge. The Mustang's canopy reflected the pale light, and through it he could see the horizon just beginning to bleed pink. He knew what was waiting ahead: formations of bombers heavy with destruction, and beyond them, the inevitable rise of German interceptors, the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s that had for so long terrorized Allied airmen. Yet there was a sense, even before wheels lifted from the tarmac, that today might tip differently. The P-51 was not just another fighter. It was the edge of a new era in the war for the skies. As the squadron climbed, contrails stitched the heavens in long white scars. German radar sets crackled to life, tracking the approach. In control rooms near the Ruhr and across northern France, operators alerted their commanders. Inbound formations, altitude 30,000 feet, speed steady. Sirens wailed at air bases, and pilots sprinted for their cockpits. The Luftwaffe still believed in its ability to dominate the air. For years, it had relied on short, ferocious strikes to tear into lumbering bomber streams, sending American crews plunging into fields and forests. Today, however, when the Luftwaffe rose to meet its enemy, it was not only bombers they found in the sky. The Mustangs were already waiting. What happened next unfolded like a storm. P-51s dove out of the sun, engines screaming, wings trembling under the strain of their speed. They closed the distance in seconds, guns chattering a deadly rhythm. German formations scattered, some breaking for altitude, others diving for the safety of cloud cover. But the Mustang had reach, long legs that allowed it to chase, pursue, and kill at ranges the Luftwaffe had once considered untouchable. In less than an hour, the air battle turned into a rout. Flames and black smoke streaked the sky as 20 Luftwaffe aircraft went down, the thunder of their destruction echoing across fields and towns below. It was not merely the loss of planes, it was the shattering of confidence, the first realization for many German pilots that the air war was slipping from their grasp. For the Americans, the victory was exhilarating but sobering. Pilots returned to base with gun barrels scorched and wings peppered by shrapnel. Some came back with empty seats in their formations, friends who had not made it. The mechanics swarmed in, counting bullet holes, patching aluminum, and reloading ammunition. Inside the debriefing rooms, pilots traced the day's kills on maps, their voices hoarse from hours under oxygen. They knew they had delivered a blow that would echo far beyond this one engagement. Germany had built its strategy on the belief that no enemy could escort bombers all the way to its heartland. The Mustang had just proved them wrong. Yet, even in triumph, there was an undercurrent of tension. The Luftwaffe was not defeated in a single day. Its pilots were hardened, its machines still formidable, and its commanders resourceful. The clash was only the opening of a broader campaign, one in which every mission carried the weight of survival. Still, when the last Mustang rolled to a halt and the final engines powered down that evening, the men on the ground sensed a shift in the war's tempo. The sky had turned red not only with fire, but with change. Germany had been stunned, and the balance of power in Europe's air war had begun to tilt irrevocably. The events of that morning would ripple outward influencing strategies, altering morale, and setting the stage for a sustained offensive that would choke the Luftwaffe of its strength. From here, the story widens, reaching back to the Mustang's improbable birth and forward into the climactic battles that secured air supremacy. The P-51 was more than a fighter. It was an idea made real. Speed, range, and power forged into a single machine that would help decide the fate of nations. The day the sky turned red was only the beginning. It began in the anxious summer of 1940, as Britain stood alone against the weight of Nazi Germany's war machine. The Battle of France had ended in catastrophe. The Luftwaffe now prowled across the Channel, and the island nation braced for invasion. In the skies above southern England, Hurricanes and Spitfires fought to exhaustion, their pilots worn thin by the relentless tempo of combat. Britain's reserves were dwindling, and its factories strained to keep up with the losses. The Royal Air Force needed more fighters, quickly, desperately, and they turned not to Europe, but across the Atlantic, to the still neutral United States. What they asked for would set in motion one of the most remarkable engineering stories of the war. The request fell to North American Aviation, a relatively young company with ambition far greater than its wartime experience. The British had initially sought to purchase Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, a serviceable but aging design that could not promise air superiority against the best of the Luftwaffe. North American countered with a bold claim. They could design and build a brand new fighter, faster and more advanced than the P-40, in less time than it would take to set up licensed production of Curtiss aircraft. It was a daring gamble, especially in 1940, when every month meant the difference between Britain's survival and collapse. The RAF accepted, and North Americans' engineers suddenly found themselves racing against both the calendar and the looming shadow of German conquest. The pressure within North Americans' Inglewood plant in California was immense. Engineers worked around the clock, sketching, drafting, and testing ideas on paper that would be metal within weeks. Their design emphasized efficiency, a streamlined fuselage with laminar flow wings to reduce drag, and a radiator system carefully engineered to balance cooling with aerodynamics. The prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out in just 102 days, a speed almost unheard of in aviation history. To onlookers, it appeared sleek and modern, its lines promising performance. But as it roared into its first test flights, the limits of its engine became immediately clear. The Allison V1710 that powered the early Mustang could not deliver at high altitudes. It was competent at low to medium levels, effective for ground attack and reconnaissance, but above 20,000 feet, the domain where bomber formations and interceptor duels would be fought, it gasped for breath. At first, this seemed to doom the Mustang to a supporting role. While the British appreciated its agility and range at low levels, they needed a fighter capable of challenging German aircraft where they truly ruled. Spitfires remained the crown jewel of high-altitude defense, but Britain could not afford to scatter them deep into enemy territory. The Mustang seemed destined to remain a useful tool, but not a decisive one. Yet war has a way of forcing innovation, and the flaw that held the Mustang back soon became the doorway to its transformation. The key lay not in American hands, but in Britain's long tradition of engine design. Rolls-Royce, already producing the Merlin engine that gave the Spitfire its legendary bite, recognized the potential of the Mustang's airframe. What if the underpowered Allison was replaced with the Merlin, with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, optimized for high-altitude performance? British engineers pressed the idea, and experimental modifications began in late 1942. The first test flights with the Merlin were nothing short of revolutionary. The aircraft leapt from being an agile but limited machine into a predator of the upper atmosphere, capable of speeds over 430 miles per hour and performance that eclipsed even the most advanced German interceptors. Suddenly, the Mustang was not just another fighter. It was the long-range escort the Allies had been searching for. The transformation was swift. Packard in the United States licensed the Merlin and began mass production, ensuring that supply would meet demand. Factories in California and Texas roared to life, producing Mustangs by the thousands, each one a blend of American engineering ambition and British technical insight. The P-51B and subsequent models carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, a range exceeding 1,600 miles with drop tanks, and the ability to climb and fight at altitudes where bombers needed protection most. The marriage of airframe and engine was almost perfect, and it arrived at a moment when the strategic bombing campaign over Germany was teetering under the weight of losses. For the men who flew it, the difference was palpable. Test pilots spoke of the newfound power, of climbing with ease into the thin air where Messerschmitts once hunted unopposed. Bomber crews who had watched in horror as waves of their comrades fell in flames over places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg now looked out their gunner windows and saw Mustangs pacing them, holding formation mile after mile. The Mustang's endurance meant that for the first time, the United States could send its bombers deep into the Reich, over Berlin itself, and know they would not be left alone in the killing grounds. The Mustang's story was not only about machinery, it was about the collaboration of nations. In its wings and engine lay the fingerprints of British desperation and American innovation, fused by the urgency of total war. Without the RAF's initial plea, there might never have been a Mustang. Without Rolls-Royce's insight, the airframe might have remained a footnote. Instead, through this transatlantic partnership, the Allies had created a weapon that would turn the skies into a battlefield of their choosing. By the time the Mustang entered combat in strength, its reputation spread faster than the aircraft themselves. German pilots who once climbed confidently to meet bomber streams now found themselves stalked, pursued, and outflown. The P-51 was no longer the unproven experiment of 1940. It was the answer to one of the war's most pressing questions: how to break the Luftwaffe's grip on Europe's skies. From the desperation of Britain's darkest hour had emerged the aircraft that would carry the Allies into the heart of Germany. But if the Mustang was born in necessity and perfected in collaboration, it would prove itself only in combat. The true test awaited not in factories or test fields, but in the skies where lives were wagered with every pull of the trigger. Ahead lay the blood and fire of missions across occupied Europe, where the Mustang's legend would be written not by engineers, but by the men who climbed into its cockpit and faced the enemy head-on. The winter skies above the English Channel were a gray, endless sheet as the formations assembled, heavy bombers stretching out across the horizon like steel beads on a string. Inside one of the lead B-17 flying fortresses, the crew sat tense and silent, their breath visible in the frigid air at 30,000 feet. The engines thundered in unison, and the familiar dread settled over the men. Every crossing of the channel had meant brutal encounters, flaming wrecks, and the nightmare of watching fellow crews spiral down into German fields. But this time, as they peered out through the Perspex windows, they saw something new. Sleek fighters slid into formation alongside them, their wings tipped with the distinctive silhouette of the P-51 Mustang. The bombers were no longer alone, and the sight changed everything. For the first year of America's daylight bombing campaign, survival had been uncertain. B-17s and B-24s had been sent into the teeth of the Reich, with promises that their defensive gunfire would be enough to fend off the Luftwaffe. But the results had been devastating. Missions like the infamous raid on Schweinfurt-Regensburg in 1943 cost more than 60 bombers in a single day, and thousands of airmen were lost to flaming skies or German captivity. Morale faltered, and even the faith in strategic bombing itself began to waver. Escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire did what they could, but their range was limited. The bombers always faced the most dangerous part of their missions, the deep penetration into Germany and the withdrawal back to the Channel, alone. The Luftwaffe waited for these moments, striking with swarms of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s that tore into formations with ruthless precision. That equation shifted the day the Mustang arrived. With drop tanks slung beneath their wings, the P-51s could fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The first crossings were cautious, pilots still learning how to balance fuel, altitude, and the tactics of escort. The Mustangs would weave in great arcs above and around the bomber streams, using their superior speed to pounce on German interceptors before they could close. For the bomber crews, the effect was immediate. Gunner logs began to record fewer desperate firefights, fewer waves of German fighters pressing home their attacks. Instead, many Luftwaffe planes turned away early, unwilling to face the agile predators waiting above them. The pilots themselves were discovering the Mustang's capabilities in real combat. In the cockpit, the visibility was excellent. The bubble canopy allowed an almost unbroken view of the skies, and the Merlin engine delivered the power needed to climb fast and strike hard. The aircraft handled smoothly even at high speeds, a crucial advantage when dueling German fighters that relied on quick climbs and tight turns. American pilots quickly learned to exploit these strengths. Instead of getting bogged down in turning battles, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving on German formations from above, delivering a burst of 50 caliber fire, and then climbing back to altitude before the enemy could react. The Luftwaffe's once feared Experten, seasoned aces with dozens of kills, began to find themselves on the defensive. Personal accounts capture the transformation vividly. Bomber crews described the surreal relief of watching Mustangs slice into enemy formations just as the Germans began their attack runs. One gunner wrote in his diary that for the first time he felt like someone had finally closed the door against the wolves. Mustang pilots, many barely out of their teens, spoke of the adrenaline of their first kills, the shock of seeing an enemy aircraft burst into flames beneath their guns. But they also told of the constant danger, fuel gauges dropping too low before the channel was crossed, wings chewed up by cannon fire, friends who failed to return. The Mustang offered no guarantees, it offered only a fighting chance. The statistics began to tell their own story. By early 1944, Luftwaffe losses mounted alarmingly. For every mission the bombers flew, more German interceptors were being destroyed, their replacements harder and harder to find. Training programs could not keep pace, and inexperienced German pilots were thrown into combat against seasoned American and British veterans. The balance was tipping, slowly but unmistakably. Each crossing of the channel became not just a bombing mission, but a battle for air supremacy, and the Mustangs were proving decisive. The Luftwaffe responded with ferocity. Large formations were hurled against the Allied raids, often coordinated from multiple airfields, but the Mustangs were increasingly aggressive, no longer content to simply protect the bombers. They began to range ahead, hunting German fighters before they reached the bomber streams, striking them as they formed up after takeoff. German pilots complained bitterly of being ambushed, caught before they could even climb to altitude. The hunter had become the hunted. Yet, the shift was not without cost. Mustang losses were real, and the burden on the young pilots immense. Missions lasted 6 or 7 hours, with long stretches of silence broken suddenly by moments of chaos and death. Exhaustion, cold, and fear wore down even the strongest men. Still, the knowledge that their presence meant the difference between hundreds of bomber crewmen returning home or perishing in flames kept them pressing forward. The bond between bomber crews and their escorts became one of the quiet brotherhoods of the war. Airmen who rarely spoke to each other face to face, yet owed their lives to one another. As the winter of 1943 turned into the spring of 1944, the evidence was undeniable. The skies above Europe were changing. The Luftwaffe could no longer dominate at will, and the Great Daylight Bombing Campaign, once questioned for its horrific losses, was now pushing deeper and deeper into German territory. The first blood had been drawn, and it had revealed a new reality. The P-51 Mustang was not simply another fighter. It was the shield and sword of the air war, an aircraft that had turned the perilous crossings of the Channel into opportunities to seize the initiative. But this was only the beginning. Ahead lay the great battles of 1944, when the Luftwaffe would throw everything it had into stopping the Allied tide, and the Mustang would have to prove not only its worth, but its endurance in the most critical struggle for control of Europe's skies. The German pilot pressed his gloved hand against the canopy glass, squinting into the bright winter sun as his Messerschmitt climbed to intercept another American bomber formation. For months, these missions had been routine, difficult, bloody, but predictable. The strategy was simple: strike the bombers hard and fast, overwhelm their defenses, and retreat before escort fighters could intervene. Yet, as he leveled off at altitude, the shimmering contrails above betrayed a new presence. Out of the glare, silver shapes detached themselves and came hurtling down. There was no warning, no time to regroup. In an instant, the hunter became the hunted, and the pilot's last memory before flames engulfed his cockpit was the streak of a P-51 Mustang diving past with guns blazing. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was reeling from a transformation it had not anticipated. Once masters of European skies, its aces were now forced to fight defensively, their every maneuver shadowed by American fighters with longer range and superior performance. The Mustang had arrived in force, and it struck at the very foundation of Germany's air defense doctrine. No longer could the Luftwaffe concentrate on tearing bomber streams apart at will. Every sortie was a gamble against squadrons of Mustangs sweeping ahead and to the flanks. The impact was psychological as well as tactical. German pilots had grown accustomed to controlling the terms of engagement, climbing to high altitudes to strike the bombers where escorts could not reach. Now, they found themselves intercepted in what had once been safe airspace. Stories spread quickly through Luftwaffe units, tales of Mustangs appearing seemingly out of nowhere, diving out of the sun, slashing through formations, and vanishing before a counterattack could form. Veteran German ace Adolf Galland would later admit that the arrival of the P-51 marked a fundamental turning point. "We lost the air war," he said bluntly, "because the enemy could replace his losses, and we could not." Germany did not surrender its dominance easily. Its commanders scrambled to counter the growing threat, deploying every resource still available. New tactics were devised. Head-on bomber attacks meant to inflict maximum destruction in seconds, massed formations of fighters attempting to overwhelm the escorts, and the development of heavily armed variants like the FW-190A8, bristling with cannons. But the Mustangs adapted quickly, using their speed and altitude advantage to outmaneuver these assaults. Allied pilots learned to spot German formations forming up near their airfields and struck before the Luftwaffe could even gain height. The balance of initiative shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe reacted, while the Allies dictated. Technology offered another hope. In the spring of 1944, Germany introduced the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, a revolutionary aircraft capable of speeds no piston-engine plane could match. On paper, it was the antidote to the Mustang. In practice, it arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter the strategic picture. Production bottlenecks, Hitler's insistence on using the jet as a bomber rather than a pure interceptor, and a lack of trained pilots crippled its potential. Allied pilots, recognizing the threat, learned to catch Me-262s during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The jet was a marvel, but it could not be everywhere, and it could not stem the tide of Allied air dominance. Desperation drove the Luftwaffe to measures that bordered on the reckless. Training programs were shortened to mere weeks, sending boys barely out of their teens into cockpits against seasoned American and British veterans. Losses among these inexperienced recruits were catastrophic. The quality of Germany's once elite air force crumbled as attrition drained its pool of aces. For every Mustang lost, America could build another. For every pilot killed, another volunteer filled his seat. Germany's resources, by contrast, were dwindling. Fuel shortages forced restrictions on flight hours, reducing pilot readiness. Even ammunition became scarce in the final months, further eroding combat effectiveness. Personal accounts from the German side speak of exhaustion and inevitability. Pilots wrote of engines coughing on low-grade fuel, of watching comrades fall in flames with no chance of rescue, of being ordered into the air despite knowing the odds were hopeless. Some even admitted to relief when wounded out of action, spared the daily grind of fighting a war that could no longer be won. The Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility, so strong in 1940 and 1941, had been shattered by 1944. Meanwhile, the Mustangs' presence emboldened the Allied bombing campaign. The long-range escorts allowed raids deep into the German heartland, striking industrial centers, oil refineries, and rail networks that were the lifeblood of the Reich. Each mission tightened the noose, each raid reducing Germany's capacity to fight. The Luftwaffe, deprived of both fuel and aircraft, was increasingly unable to contest the skies. The very strategy that Germany had relied upon, the defense of the homeland by air superiority, was unraveling before their eyes. The shift was not merely tactical, it was existential. The Luftwaffe had been designed as the spear of blitzkrieg, a force to overwhelm enemies through rapid dominance of the air. By 1944, it was fighting a war of attrition it could not sustain, drained by the relentless pressure of Allied production and the lethalities of the P-51 Mustang. What began as isolated shocks, surprise interceptions, unexpected losses, became a daily reality. The skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. Yet even in its decline, the Luftwaffe fought with ferocity. Aces with hundreds of kills continued to challenge the invaders, scoring victories even against overwhelming odds. Their courage was undeniable, but it could not alter the trajectory of a war being decided by industry, logistics, and the unyielding momentum of Allied strategy. Each Mustang that crossed the Channel carried not just a pilot, but the weight of America's factories, its fuel supplies, and its will to see the war through. By the time spring turned to summer in 1944, the verdict was clear. The Luftwaffe, once feared and respected as the scourge of Europe, had become a force in retreat, hounded in the skies it once commanded. The Mustang had not simply outflown its enemy, it had broken the very spine of Germany's air defense system. And with that fracture came the opening for the Allies to launch the greatest invasion of the war. An assault that would ride on the back of air supremacy wrested from the Luftwaffe's hands. The tide had turned. The question now was not whether Germany could defend its skies, but how quickly the Allies would exploit their mastery to strike at the Reich's very heart. The decisive blow was yet to fall, and the Mustang would be there when it did. The sun was just breaking over the frosted fields of western Germany when the air raid sirens began to wail. Farmers in the Rhineland looked up from their chores, shading their eyes against the pale winter light, as distant specks grew larger and the familiar drone of heavy engines rolled across the sky. For the Luftwaffe ground crews stationed at airfields near the Ruhr, it was the start of another desperate day. Mechanics scrambled to ready Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, pilots sprinted across the tarmac, and officers barked orders through the din. Overhead, contrails stretched across the firmament, first the ponderous trails of American bombers, then the thinner, darting lines of fighters. At first, the Germans believed they were dealing with the familiar challenge of intercepting B-17s. What they could not yet know was that the P-51 squadrons accompanying them had come hunting not only to protect, but to destroy. For months, Mustang pilots had been refining their tactics. No longer content to merely shadow the bombers, they pressed into enemy airspace with an aggression that stunned even seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. On this morning, entire squadrons swept far ahead of the bomber streams, prowling the skies above German airfields. It was a deliberate strategy, to catch enemy fighters not in the clean geometry of high-altitude attacks, but in the chaos of takeoff and climb when they were most vulnerable. The plan was simple but devastating. Intercept the Luftwaffe before it could ever reach the bombers, bleed it on its own doorstep, and leave the skies open for Allied raids. The first clash came swiftly. A flight of Bf-109s, still climbing to altitude, found themselves bracketed by Mustangs diving from above with the sun at their backs. The German formation disintegrated instantly. Pilots wrenched their controls, some breaking downward, others scattering in panic. But the Mustangs had the initiative. They plunged through the loose German group, guns chattering in synchronized bursts. One Messerschmitt erupted in flames, its pilot bailing out too low for his chute to open. Another spiraled into the trees below, a column of smoke marking its grave. In minutes, half the formation was gone, and the survivors fled in disbelief that they had been attacked so early, so mercilessly. Eyewitnesses from both sides recalled the ferocity. American pilots spoke of the adrenaline rush, of diving at such speed that the wings trembled and the enemy aircraft seemed frozen in their sights. They described the eerie stillness of watching tracers walk across the sky, and then the sudden explosion as metal and fuel ignited. German accounts, by contrast, tell of shock and helplessness, expecting to fight bombers, only to be ambushed by faster, more agile opponents. One Luftwaffe veteran later wrote that the Mustangs came from everywhere. There was no safety, not even above our own bases. The battle did not end with that first ambush. It became a running engagement across miles of sky, fought in bursts of chaos as German units scrambled from one airfield after another. Each time, they were met by Mustangs already circling overhead. American pilots coordinated by radio, calling out targets, diving and climbing in pairs, always covering one another. The teamwork was ruthless and efficient. Where the Luftwaffe once dominated with veteran Rote pairs of aces, now it was the Americans who dictated the terms. The German formations, increasingly filled with inexperienced youths pushed into combat after only weeks of training, were ripped apart. By midday, the scale of the disaster was clear. 20 Luftwaffe aircraft had been destroyed in the space of a few hours, many of them without firing a shot in anger. Wreckage smoldered in forests and fields, parachutes drifted down over villages, and the once proud German squadrons limped home shattered. Some airfields counted more aircraft lost than returned. Ground crews stood helplessly at the edges of runways, watching smoke columns mark the fates of comrades who had barely lifted off. For the Luftwaffe, already weakened by fuel shortages and attrition, the losses were catastrophic. The psychological blow was even greater. For years, German pilots had believed that home soil offered a measure of safety, that they could climb to altitude and choose their moment to strike. That illusion was gone. Now the war reached into their own bases, leaving no sanctuary. Veteran aces, men who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, confessed that they felt hunted, their skills squandered against an enemy that seemed always to appear first, strike hardest, and vanish with impunity. For the younger pilots, thrown into cockpits with barely a dozen hours of training, the effect was crushing. They were asked to fight legends in machines that could no longer match their foe. For the Americans, the day was remembered as both triumph and vindication. After years of staggering bomber losses, after the doubts that strategic bombing could ever succeed, here was proof that air superiority was within reach. Squadron diaries recount the exhilaration of returning to base, cockpits rattling from bullet holes, but pilots grinning through exhaustion. Debriefings buzzed with kill counts, yet also with a sobering awareness of the cost. Some pilots did not return, and empty chairs in the mess hall were a reminder that even dominance did not come without sacrifice. Still, the prevailing feeling was that something had changed irreversibly. The Luftwaffe had been broken on its own ground. This battle was more than a tally of aircraft destroyed. It was a symbol. It marked the moment when Germany's long reign of aerial terror truly began to collapse. 20 fighters lost in hours did not merely reduce numbers. It shattered confidence, drained morale, and exposed the Luftwaffe's inability to defend its own skies. It told every bomber crew that their escorts could not only protect them, but take the fight directly to the enemy. It told every German pilot climbing into his machine that the air war was no longer his to win. In hindsight, historians see this engagement as a microcosm of the wider struggle. It was not just about machines or tactics. It was about endurance, production, and will. The Mustangs were the sharp edge of an industrial giant, each one built in factories that never slept, fueled by resources Germany could not match. The Luftwaffe, bled white by years of war, could not sustain losses of this magnitude. Every fallen pilot was irreplaceable, every destroyed aircraft a hole in a defense that was rapidly unraveling. As the sun set that day, the contrails faded from the sky, leaving only smoke rising from the wrecks below. For the men on the ground in Germany, it was a grim portent of what was to come. The Reich had once commanded the air with near absolute power. Now its defenders fell in flames above their own fields. For the Americans, the Mustangs that landed back in England carried more than victory. They carried the certainty that the Luftwaffe's supremacy was finished. The day of reckoning had come, and the skies of Europe would never again belong to Germany. The path ahead pointed toward an invasion that would ride on the wings of air dominance, and the Mustang had proven it would be there to lead the way. The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke over the English Channel, with the low rumble of thousands of ships pressing toward Normandy, their wakes cutting through gray water like scars across the sea. Overhead, the skies were strangely quiet, for the Luftwaffe was absent. Instead, the roar belonged to the Allies. Among the most recognizable silhouettes that morning were the P-51 Mustangs, flying high cover above the invasion fleet. Their wings bore black and white invasion stripes, hastily painted on in the days before D-Day, a stark symbol of unity and overwhelming strength. For the soldiers crammed aboard landing craft below, the sight was a reassurance beyond words. The skies belonged to them, and the enemy's once feared fighters were nowhere to be seen. That supremacy had not come easily. In the months leading to the invasion, Mustangs swept relentlessly across the continent. They hunted German fighters, strafed trains and convoys, and loitered over airfields until nothing could take off without risking annihilation. When the first Allied troops set foot on the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe could muster only a handful of sorties, scattered and ineffective. One German pilot later admitted that the day of invasion was the day we realized we no longer had an air force. The Mustang, in its tireless patrols, had helped strip Germany of its wings. As the war pushed forward into France and beyond, the Mustang's role only expanded. Once the guardian of bombers, it became an offensive weapon in its own right. Low-level strafing missions turned rail yards, truck convoys, and supply depots into infernos. Squadrons roamed freely over occupied territory, disrupting reinforcements, isolating battlefields, and ensuring that German divisions facing the Allies fought without reliable resupply. In the Ardennes during the winter of 1944, Mustangs braved snow and fog to harass retreating German units. In the final drive into Germany, they cut bridges and rail links, crippling the Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver. The Mustang had grown beyond escort. It had become a scalpel of destruction, cutting deep into the arteries of Hitler's war machine. The scale of its production mirrored the scale of America's industrial might. North American aviation's factories worked around the clock, stamping out fuselages, bolting on Merlin engines built under license by Packard, and rolling Mustangs off assembly lines at a pace the Reich could scarcely comprehend. By war's end, over 15,000 Mustangs had been built. Each one represented not just a fighter, but the combined power of workers, engineers, and a nation bent on overwhelming the enemy with quantity matched to quality. For every German aircraft lost, replacements came slower and rarer. For every Mustang downed, another took its place within weeks. The equation was merciless. Yet behind the statistics lay the human cost. Every Mustang carried a pilot whose survival depended on hours of skill and seconds of luck. Many never returned. Aces were celebrated in newspapers, their portraits inspiring back home, but countless others perished anonymously in frozen skies over the Reich. Bomber crews who once braced for death on every raid now had a better chance to live, thanks to the Mustang's shadow above them. Letters written from waist gunners to wives and mothers often spoke of the gratitude they felt at seeing those silver fighters glide into escort formation. "There are angels," one wrote, "and they keep us alive." Veterans' voices echo with reverence when they remember the machine itself. Pilots described the Mustang as an extension of their own body, responsive, fast, forgiving. One recalled that it was the only airplane I ever flew where I felt like I had an advantage before the fight even began. For many, it was more than aluminum and rivets. It was salvation, a lifeline that carried them through Europe's inferno. For some Luftwaffe veterans, grudging respect followed. They recognized the Mustang as a formidable enemy, one that ended the dominance they had once enjoyed. The Mustang's legacy did not fade with the war's end. It served again in Korea, dueling jet aircraft and proving its resilience in a new era. Around the world, nations adopted it into their air forces, keeping it in service for decades. Beyond combat, it became an enduring symbol of American ingenuity and Allied cooperation. Museums, air shows, and veterans' reunions still echo with the unmistakable roar of the Merlin engine, a sound that once meant hope to some and doom to others. Looking back, historians see the Mustang as more than a technical marvel. It was a weapon that altered the trajectory of a global conflict, a tool that turned strategy into victory. It embodied the synthesis of necessity and innovation, Britain's desperate call, America's industrial response, and the ingenuity of engineers who fused design with performance. It proved that wars are won not only by courage in the cockpit, but by the factories, the workers, and the alliances behind them. When veterans speak of it today, their words are simple but profound. "It brought us home," many say. For those who survived, the Mustang was not just a machine of war. It was the steel wings that carried them through history's most brutal chapter. And for those who never returned, it remains the last faithful companion they ever knew, soaring above the smoke and fire of a world at war, a guardian until the very end.